Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Trends in Agricultural Policy, Simpson College's virtual program for National Agriculture Day. My name is Seth Anderson, and I serve as director of the John C. Culver Public Policy Center at Simpson College. Today's program is jointly hosted by the Culver Center and the Department of Political Science, with co-sponsorship from the Drake Agricultural Law Center and Two Rivers Cooperative. The Culver Center has hosted numerous programs on agricultural and land use issues over the past decade, starting with an appearance that Bill Northey made as Iowa Secretary of Agriculture in February 2014. The Culver Center has since hosted programs focusing on water quality and soil health, collaborated with Simpson students and faculty conducting research on the invasive weed Palmer amaranth, and hosted a debate between the two candidates for Iowa Secretary of Agriculture in 2018, Mike Nagg and Tim Gannon, which was also moderated by Donnelle Eller of the Des Moines Register. Please note that tonight's program is being recorded, but attendees and their questions will not appear on screen or be identifiable. Only the moderator and panelists will be captured on video and audio. Please type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom at any point during the program. Our moderator, Donnelle Eller, will pose selected questions to panelists during the final segment of today's program. It is now my pleasure to introduce Assistant Professor Adrienne Gathman of Simpson's Department of Political Science. Professor Gathman earned her undergraduate degree from Simpson College, her law degree from Drake Law School, and her PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Dallas. She has a long-standing interest in agricultural law and policy and has been a great partner in the development of this event and another recent program that examined climate change activism among communities of faith. Adrienne?
Thanks, Seth, and good evening, everyone. As the Political Science Department representative, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to a program that it is our great pleasure to co-sponsor on this National Agriculture Day. As a born and raised Iowan who grew up going to her grandparents' farm and to her dad's office in a farmer's cooperative, I've been closely tied to agriculture my entire life, as have many in our Simpson community. Those who didn't grow up around it are now surrounded by it in a state leading in agricultural production. This, combined with a former Iowa governor now back at the helm of the USDA, creates an atmosphere ripe for conversations in this policy arena. The idea for this program grew out of that connection to agriculture we all have and inspired us to reach out to experts in the area who have considerable experience and varying perspectives. I again want to welcome and thank you all for coming and joining this discussion. I'll now turn it over to our moderator for today, Donnelle Eller. Donnelle serves as the agricultural and energy reporter for the Des Moines Register, covering farming, the environment, and energy issues statewide and often nationwide. Donnelle has been at the Register for over 20 years and has recently covered topics ranging from the impacts of the derecho and pandemic on agriculture, to the cold snap's effect on utility bills, to climate change and flooding, to Vilsack's return to the USDA. I'm sure the discussion and conversation will be rich, and I want to thank Donnelle for serving as the program's moderator. We will have time for question and answers, as Seth pointed out, so please send any questions you have to Donnelle in the question and answer box. Donnelle?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming, listening in, and welcome to Bill Northey, the former USDA Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation, and Jennifer Zwagerman, Director of the Drake University Agricultural Law Center. I think I might just, to start off everything, give Bill Northey a couple of minutes just to update us all on what you're doing now. Bill, I think you're muted.
There we go. Now that
there.
Somebody has to do it to start with, right? Okay, so it's
right.
me. So I'm not planting corn, and even though there's some corn up from a previous year behind me here, but I am back in Iowa, and it's good to be back in Iowa, back in central Iowa right now. Looking forward to being able to get back to the farm in spring here, and at least help my brother-in-law farm up in northwest Iowa, Spirit Lake. So doing a little conversations and consulting with some groups around sustainability and what that means for their association or their company, And so working on some of that, I think there's others that are interested in more of that as well. So right now, that looks like what I'll be doing is parts for several different kinds of companies and associations. Certainly, I'm sure an issue that we'll talk about is what sustainability mean to farmers? What's it mean to companies? Is it a market? Is it carbon sequestration? There's a lot of pieces out there that is a lot of uncertainty for many in ag right now.
Well, you just teed me up there. I was just going to kick off our conversation with a discussion about agriculture's role in mitigating climate change. I'm curious how you folks see that playing out.
So, I mean, we've heard the secretary talk a lot about it, the president as well, talk about the opportunities to be able to store carbon in soil. Certainly because agriculture does so many things out there, it has a footprint, uses energy to do that. It interacts with the soil. There's an opportunity to be able to store more carbon in the soil. There's an opportunity to do things that will lessen the amount of carbon that gets into the air, maybe the amount of methane as well from livestock operations and from fertilizer applications. Some of those are known and understood. We have a hard time exactly knowing what to account for them yet. And there are folks that are looking to make some kind of early efforts into paying farmers for storing that carbon. Secretary has talked about trying a role for USDA, whether it's a carbon bank that defines what credits are, whether it's encouraging farmers to do the right thing and letting the private markets kind of take it. And then there's a whole nother kind of third element out there, and it could be that the supply chain asks for it. Maybe the folks that want to buy my corn will say, I want low carbon corn, maybe to feed an ethanol plant, maybe to in a corn sweetener someplace or in my livestock operation, and they will pay me a little bit for that. So if it costs me some to operate in a more climate friendly way and to store some carbon, that the market will actually ask me to do that as well. So I think there's a lot to figure out, but there's certainly some opportunities for agriculture.
Jennifer, what do you see?
I agree that there are definitely a lot of opportunities for agriculture to take the lead in this area of really trying to mitigate and manage carbon emissions even beyond what the agricultural industry produces. I think Bill named kind of the three key areas right off the top of what could drive these markets. And to me, they all raise different challenges. And I really would push USDA to be significantly involved in the role because of some of the challenges I see. If we look at the supply chain market, I think that's an ideal situation because it recognizes that this matters to everyone, not just the industry itself. You know, that it does matter across the globe and at all areas of the supply chain. But my concern is that there will be significant costs for farmers in that and not a lot of return to manage that. I think we've seen that in a lot of practices from animal welfare and beyond, that the market drives, but it doesn't, the increase in price or whatever it might be doesn't get passed down. And so that raises concerns for me. And if we think about the private market, there's some of the same concerns there, but also the concern about consistency. This idea of carbon sinks or continued need to mitigate carbon. It needs to be something that has some stability to it, something that more like our conservation reserve program, where you have long-term contracts that would be involved in this. And otherwise it's not going to work to be able to do this year after year. And so that's really why I think USDA can step in and play a role in that. We have through those types of conservation programs, sort of I don't want to say a plan, but at least a similar type of framework, groundwork in place that might be able to be used in some shape or form to help develop this program. And if it could turn out to be some sort of public-private partnership where you could bring in these and really make sure that producers are protected, that the producers are in it for the long term, and that they see some of this return if it is driven by private or supply chain markets, I think that would be a wonderful situation to see happen.
How do you, there's been a lot of discussion about their creation of a carbon bank within the Commodity Credit Corporation. And I'm just curious if you folks have kind of sussed out how that might work.
I'm going to hope Jenny has, because I haven't yet. So, and I actually, obviously my role at USDA, I served as president of CCC. So very familiar with its activities now. It does finance many of the farm programs, conservation programs, farmers that get marketing assistance loans, which are 9-month crop loans, $7 to $10 billion a year. They pay those back. That goes through CCC. And so the secretary said rightly, it still has some things it needs to do. And this needs to operate without putting any kind of threat into those. But I still haven't figured out exactly what a carbon bank looks like, whether it's an actual lending, a buying, a temporary holding, or just a descriptor for what carbon looks like. I have, some folks have said, because, and I think Jenny's right, there's a lot of different kinds of programs out there, and a lot of folks are talking about different things, and it's confusing to farmers. And we'd like some consistency, but one problem is we don't yet know what's going to work over the longer term either. And so some have said really what we need from USDA is continued support on conservation, and maybe let those private markets kind of figure it out. But let's up the amount of dollars, the resources, the federal dollars that go into conservation that encourage cover crops and that provide maybe a long-term carbon bank that's similar to on working lands, that's similar to a CRP, so that we know there's some sustainability in that carbon that goes into the soil. Now that doesn't sound like a bank, but it certainly sounds like encouraging more carbon friendly activities and letting the science kind of catch up to the challenges of creating a market without the full science.
I think that need.
Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that need for continued research and support from USDA is key at this point. But I think we've seen other situations where we have a term that means different things to different people, and we don't get the long-term continued results that we want to see, simply because people are doing different things and calling it the same term. And that's another role where USDA could step in and set some of those guidelines, whether it be just how to define terms. You know, we have the ag biotech glossary that they've put together, right? And so that sort of serves as a baseline definition for folks when it comes to things. We need someone to be able to step in and define these terms so that no matter who in the market, private, government, you know, a producer, is using it, we know what it means when we talk about carbon sinks and carbon banks and define those. Otherwise, I think, again, it leaves room for not just confusion, but also manipulation of a system. If we don't have that understanding and those consistent terms, if somebody can find a way to manipulate a system and make money off it, they're going to do that. So let's define it in a way that sets those sort of priorities and the key elements that we need to see. And some of that may be developed through that continued research. But if we can coordinate at a national scale, some of the pilot programs and serve as sort of a depository for information and help share that information, I think that's really where we need to start.
I'm going to throw out a question from our participants. John asked, is the current corn soybean system consistent with sustainability initiatives?
I think it can be. And certainly we have folks that are doing a great job in raising it with no-till and cover crops, and you know, the productive lands that we have here in Iowa, there's no irrigation required. And so I really do think that there's an opportunity, but I also think that there is an opportunity to expand that too. There's a lot of conversation about small grains and certainly the use of cover crops, including the ability to use them for economic gain, besides what they do for the soil and storing carbon, they potentially are feeding cattle and they may produce oil and there are other things that can be done there too, that maybe you get 3 crops in 2 years of sorts. And so I think there will be other things, and I think this will offer an opportunity for other things, but we raise corn and soybeans really well in this state. And if we can do that in a way that is more carbon friendly, I think it's a good mix in addition to some of these other kinds of opportunities that we can add to.
I think it's correct that it could be agreeable or, compatible with this type of focus, but I'm not sure that where we are right now is there. And without, nobody's favorite word here, but regulations, something that's going to really start to enforce or find some way to entice people to take on more of those, not just carbon friendly, but environmentally friendly practices through cover crops or different types of filters and those types of things. I don't think we're going to be able to get the type of buy-in that we need to make it as efficient and as effective as we want it to be. We definitely need to find a way that not just incentivizes producers to take on these practices and consider these types of additional crops and cover crops, but figure out how to get them paid for it as well, for taking this on. We've talked about, and I'm sure we will more here, but how tight the agricultural markets are, the economy, and being difficult for producers even in a good year to survive and make any money. And then yet we're asking them to start bringing on all these new practices and additional practices with no guarantee that they're going to get any sort of return on that investment. And if we're going to put value on agriculture in a whole host of ways, that we found the country on it, and we still think it's one of the most important industries that we have, we want to support, and yet we want to do that in a sustainable way, then we've got to figure out how to support farmers to encourage adoption of those practices beyond just the traditional incentives that we've done so far. And if we do that, then maybe corn and soybeans can continue to be grown here the way that we've done with the addition of these practices. But whether that is the best for the soil and those types of conversations, I think need to be addressed in there as well.
Yeah, I think
Bill,
certainly. Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think economics is a big piece of this. So as Jenny said, some of the numbers being talked about right now for carbon, I can create a ton of carbon and it's going to be worth $15 or $20 an acre on land that's producing $900 worth of corn and cost me $40 to put cover crops on or $30 to put cover crops on. It's not the incentive that drags folks. Now, again, I don't think just saying that we need to force them to use small grains that, earn $600 an acre or something. If there's profit there and if there's alternatives here that help make that happen, I do think it needs to be incentive based as much as we can. Now, the incentives can't be simply what they look to be right now. Is carbon going to be worth more? Can we figure out more ways to do it? Can we do carbon plus water benefits plus supply chain business benefits, and therefore by stacking all 3 of those together, create more than enough to buy some no-till equipment and plant cover crops. And to me, those are the pieces that, and it's going to be different. Jenny and I may be farming across the fence from each other, and she's going to do something different than I'm going to do. Right? I mean, we're going to both, we both may not run the same color equipment, and there are lots of reasons why we need to do different things. And that's one of the reasons I think it's really hard for government to say, you must raise 20% of your crops as small grains, or you must do, cover crops that look like a 4 species mix or something, because everybody's a little different here, and it's hard to be able to appropriately touch their land the right way, their operation the right way, the way that they farm the right way. And so that's one of the reasons regulations are a challenge, especially in this area where we're talking about biology and agronomy.
Jennifer, do you think this focus on climate change, can farmers be assured that that same focus will be there in 4 years?
My gut reaction to that one, I mean, no one can, I wish I could predict the future, but my gut reaction is that there will be some focus. There's too much global, local, national interest and push in this area for us to think it's going to disappear in 4 years, 8 years, whatever it might be. If I had to compare it to something, we could compare it to, I think the move that we saw in animal welfare issues and how that continued. The move that we saw with bioengineering and labeling and that push from consumers and moving into government. I think that climate and the environment are issues that we're going to see continue to be pushed at a grassroots level, and that's not going to disappear. There's too much happening and too much attention, like I said, not just locally, but around the world for us to expect it to go away at this point.
What do you think, Bill?
And I agree. I think that's right. And now what it looks like, maybe the government will be in a bigger way, maybe be a lesser way, maybe some of the things it does in the next 6 months will not be things that are still there the same way 3 years from now. But I do think there's kind of a major international kind of effort. There's greater attention. Farmers are more willing to look at it. And then many of the things that we talk about for agriculture are actually generally quite constructive. And so I sometimes get the question from farmers, what should I do? You know, I don't know what the markets are. Do I need to sell some credits? Do I need to do some other things? And I say, you know, figure out what's right for your farm. Try and do some pieces. Do some cover crops on a small piece of your land if you haven't been doing it. Do more mix of cover crop species if you're just doing a few. Look at going to the place where, as this comes and there's more form to it, you'll be more ready to be able to figure out what you want to take advantage of, or you want to jump into, and which of those opportunities are right for you. So don't sit on the sidelines because you think it may not be around. Figure out some things, but there's also still a lot to figure out in what that market looks like. And for some folks that have already made the conversion, they're not creating change if they continue to do what they're doing. Now, they appeal greatly to somebody that's looking for supply chain value, but they don't necessarily appeal as well to somebody who's looking for net carbon benefits versus a handful of years ago if they started no-tilling 10 years ago or cover cropping 5 or 10 years ago.
Along some of those same lines, let me just shift gears a little bit. What do you sort of see the future for ethanol, biodiesel, and which is obviously very important here in Iowa? The administration has talked about its push towards electric vehicles. I guess I'm wondering, does that mean the end of ethanol in Iowa? Jump in.
I mean, I certainly don't think so. I don't think so in the short term. And I think really in the long term, it's going to be one of the most carbon friendly liquid fuels. And there's going to be liquid fuels around for quite a while. And it can actually be made more carbon friendly by either the way the crop is grown or the capturing of CO2 off that fermentation process that happens at the plant. So I think there's more opportunity for ethanol than there is for oil out there. And I also think that, I mean, there's an old phrase that's used sometimes, these major changes happen slower than you think they're going to take, but they also are more impactful. than you think they're going to be. And so I think this could be very impactful. If we really do go, we're going to need a lot of electricity. We're going to have to build a lot of electrical capacity out there to be able to change everything over to electrical cars. And it's going to take a big investment. There's going to be a lot of batteries created, and there's going to be a lot of things, and that's going to take some time if it all happens that way. In the meantime, we're going to produce a lot of ethanol here. It's good for our livestock that use the DDGs. It's a great local product to be able to have. But I do think the ethanol industry is looking very seriously of how do they fit into a world that has more electrical vehicles. And does that mean their competition is against electrical vehicles or against some of the other liquid fuels? Or maybe they have some other opportunities out there that they'll be able to participate in, and other products or other kinds of things that will allow that corn still to go to a processing plant, still keep jobs in that community, and still be a market for the crop.
I'm one of those, I would love to see nothing but electric cars out on the road at some point here. But I do recognize that raises its own set of challenges as well. And I think the debate about ethanol and renewable fuels really sort of goes into the larger opportunities for agriculture when it comes to renewable energy, period. You know, if we look at solar and wind, I have some friends in Michigan that are looking at as a retirement option, perhaps turning your entire farm into a solar, big scale solar opportunity. You know, things like that is what can we do to help support kind of this type of industry, still keep the land undeveloped with opportunities, but look at the bigger environmental pictures as well. And there are a lot of opportunities, whether it be wind or solar, that we could all be trying to incorporate a little bit more. And I think that the idea of ethanol and renewable fuels long-term are going to get caught up in that. The electric cars are definitely going to be a competitor in some ways, but again, an opportunity, I think in some ways, like Bill said, for them to look at what's next. We're continually going to be needing to look at what's next and what can we turn this into that meets the needs of that next generation of vehicles. Maybe it's not the fuel, but it's lubricants and other types of items that go into these that they're going to need. There's definitely going to be opportunities as long as people invest in them. And that's going to take both private and public investment. The work that can be done if we support this at a public level, you know, through universities, I think would be amazing to be able to see that continue. But really to look at these companies trying to focus on what's next, not just oil, not just ethanol, not just gas, and be relevant to encourage the innovation and recognize that there is this focus on environmental issues that go beyond just carbon when it comes to fuel use. Be a leader, you know, step up and be seen as a leader in that movement and a partner in it. I think there's a lot of areas where if everyone can be seen as working towards similar goals, maybe for different reasons, but towards similar goals, that we can get more done and be more productive in these types of areas. But it takes, in some ways, a mind shift from seeing something as competition that's going to drive me out of business to saying, okay, what can we work with you on? Where are your needs? You know, whatever it might be, to figure out how to still be relevant. Because I would hate to see a lot of those plants disappear. But long term, we've seen that in a lot of industries, right? There's change, things go away. You know, at one time we had packing plants up and down the coast, and you know, now that's changed. So we have to be in a position where we're movable, we're adaptable. And the more flexible we can be, I think the better rural economies and the ag economy are going to be overall.
And I think Jenny also mentioned that I think there's going to be an interesting kind of discussion at some point around land use of wind and solar, and there already is in some places. You know, some folks love solar or wind, and it works so well around agriculture. Other folks don't like it. Solar is going to be the same thing, and there will be some competition for land. Now, most of us would say, hey, let's allow some farming of whatever kind for the land that's fit to do that, and let's put the solar where sun still hits but isn't as productive. But that may or may not be that easy, and there needs to be, it can fit together in ways where you put solar. There's a lot of solar on hog buildings around Iowa, and in other small pieces, and there can be lots of ways where it can fit in with an operation that's out there, and yet there's probably going to be some places where we're going to have some big arguments over whether that ought to happen as well. If we're going to grow both of those the way that we need to grow those to be able to supply the electricity that's being talked about.
You've both talked about sort of how renewable, clean energy and could create jobs in rural areas. I think it's pretty well established that rural Iowa areas are struggling economically. And I'm just curious, the USDA has tried to boost its investment in broadband, but I guess I'm just wondering if actions by the government need to go beyond sort of, let's get everybody network or, better internet. Not that that's a bad thing, but what can happen to make rural areas more vital?
I think broadband is a key aspect of that, but it goes hand in hand with making sure that you have the additional things that people need to want to live in a community. So do I have access to the internet? Absolutely necessary. As we look at this current pandemic, if you don't have good internet, working from home is difficult at best, as we've all experienced over the last year. But you also need to look at our rural schools, rural healthcare, food access is a big thing. We've talked recently. I know Fairway just last week was announcing their small town sort of project up in Colfax, and we've seen kind of the co-op model of stores coming in with Jewel and a few other communities. But access to grocery stores and how do we sustain those in small communities are really challenges as well, knowing that people are a lot more mobile. You have access to this urban areas and cities and Amazon and all these other types of ways that people can get food now. So is broadband important? Absolutely. But we've got to recognize, I think, a couple of things. One, we've got to look at the big picture for the services and the needs to draw people, and not just draw them, but keep them. And housing is a key element of that too, to have. But then we also have to look at recognizing that it takes a bigger investment that in some ways seems outsized compared to the population aspect, and find a way to sort of express the value and to the rest of the community, meaning the urban areas and people that don't live there, that strong, rural, vibrant communities have, that whether it's energy production or food production or just care of the land and open spaces, national lands, whatever it might be, there is value in having those rural areas. We don't want everyone to be in an urban area. And so if that means that we have to put in a little bit more than seems balanced compared to the population, we may need to do that because there are different problems and different issues, and the responses, even if it's the same problem as healthcare or substance abuse care, it's a challenge both in urban and rural areas, but the ways to address it are going to be very different and potentially more expensive in rural areas as well. So there's got to be sort of that aspect of how do we communicate that there's value in where this money is going, in addition to actually finding the resources.
I think that's right. And I think you're right too. In broadband is just the base here. Broadband has to happen. Like electrification had to happen, it has to happen. Agriculture needs it. Every manufacturing plant out there, every school, every hospital needs it too. And it needs to be as accessible in rural areas as it is in urban areas. And that's hard because people are scattered and it costs more. But I think there'll be another big push here. There's some technologies that maybe make it not quite as hard, but it's still hard. And so that has to happen. And then all the other infrastructure pieces is absolutely right, from water to everything else that's in a community. And what's the value of those rural areas? Certainly food production is no small part of it. Look what just happened in a pandemic. We're still able to produce food, and that's a good thing. But it's also caring for the environment out there. You know, a lot of our water comes from those rural areas, and we need folks to be profitable, to be able to do the right thing on their farms and in the communities out there. We need to find other ways to create jobs around, I would argue, at least around agriculture to some degree. And we have many great rural manufacturing jobs out there, often related to agriculture. And we have them that are not related. They're related to healthcare and other kinds of things. And those we can easily drive by without even realizing it. And I think broadband helps that. There's some people that want to live there now, even more than they did a year ago. And we need to have the amenities so that we can make it friendly for folks to be out there. But the secretary's talked a lot about food systems and trying to have less large stuff and more small stuff, and more direct market stuff. And that's not all easy. There's a reason we've developed, there's some efficiencies in scale, but at the same token, I think there's an interest in finding ways to create more markets. There's a concentration in ag on the purchasing side of livestock and some of the other product supply side too, that there's going to be some pushback, and those offer some opportunities for other suppliers out there as well. So I don't know if that's enough. You know, ethanol plants did great things for many rural communities, but not all of them, because they're not everywhere. But where they are, they were a huge help to some rural communities. And some will tell you that they stopped the erosion and actually created new jobs in a few communities that hadn't seen new jobs in years. Weren't, you know, certainly if they're threatened and those are issues, but can we look at what can be the same kind of thing related to wanting to be in that rural environment and the agriculture production, whether it's unique and different, whether it's a local meat processing plant that can be out there that can provide something special for the world, or just for Iowans, that it creates some local jobs. Again, none of those are going to be this total solution, but all together they can be part of that solution.
Hey, I do want to ask you, you've mentioned meat packing, and during the coronavirus, the public health crisis, we talked a lot about, or there was a lot of concern about worker safety. And I just wanted to ask you, what policies do you think we should be looking at to make sure that workers in meatpacking plants and those essential workers that still are, you know, in our grocery stores, what should we be looking at to make sure that they're safe?
Yeah, for me, I think we've learned a lot in the last year as far as trying to protect people from a coronavirus, but the next threat's going to be probably different than that, right? And the concentration that it takes of a large number of people in a small space, at least the way we were set up, that looked like the most efficient, that made the most sense until we had a coronavirus, and then we couldn't even figure out exactly what was the right thing to do, because we certainly still needed that processing to be able to get food. We still had animals that needed to go somewhere, and it was important to figure out a way, the old building a plane while we're flying it kind of thing. Some of it worked and some of it wasn't great. But folks did work at figuring it out. They're in a better spot now. But I do think that's where the secretary is going to talk about, you know, spreading that food system out and providing some other opportunities. And it doesn't mean that you can't have COVID in a small plant, but the impact is different than if you shut down one large plant. And so, as well as it's probably easier to contain, it's easier to test. There's a lot of ease that happens in those smaller plants. Maybe some efficiency issues, but but as far as worker safety and some other things that I think there's going to be a real effort. I've seen 3 different plants being announced, 2 of them in Iowa and another one in Nebraska just recently. New small plants compared to the big plants out there. And they believe there's an opportunity, and those are communities that are very happy to have jobs. And I think they're also going to construct them in a way where worker safety is absolutely understood, because we just went through a pandemic.
And I think one of the things that I most hope sort of comes out of this pandemic in the long term, not just kind of our general health and safety population, but is this recognition of how much we rely, I mean, the essential worker, right, in this food system. And whether it be the grocery store workers or the meat plant workers, how much as a country we rely on them and don't think twice, before this about their working conditions. And there's a lot of reasons that could be, but my hope is that as we move forward, we start to think about the working conditions, not just from virus passing, the safety of how we, take care of each other and the illness type issue, but what's driving the decisions when it comes to things like line speed, or how we evaluate those decisions in the plant, and how worker safety factors into those. What's safe enough? What's where do we draw that line between a certain amount of increased profit because we can get more per hour through, versus a certain percentage of risk to those on the line, to employees. There's no doubt there's always going to be some sort of balance when it comes to these types of decisions. Nothing is ever going to be 100% perfect in these industries. But my hope is that we start to look at the bigger picture of working conditions, and again, the sort of rationale behind these decisions, where we put that emphasis, and not forget the need that we have, the service that they provide on a basis once we move out of the pandemic. Not just working conditions, but wages and hours and all of those types of things, to really look at that big picture. But I think worker safety from a variety of areas is something that definitely needs to continued focus. These are especially meat processing facilities. Whether it be repetitive injuries or working around the equipment, there's definitely a lot of danger in those types of risk for injury in those industries. And I hope we don't forget that. Part of my fear is that we're all going to go back to whatever the new normal is, and just go back to our regular patterns as well, and our regular kind of worries and day to day, and sort of still forget the people that we so relied upon day to day to feed us and make sure we had food in the grocery store. And that's my hope, is that it won't, but my fear is that we will.
You could imagine that
Kate?
I think on a National Ag Day, we often just think of farmers, and we should think of farmers, but we should think of the whole essential folks out there, that from meat packing plants to tractor tire makers in Des Moines. There's a huge agricultural industry that together delivers food products to folks, and that's all part of agriculture today. And so we all need to, certainly after the last year, pay more attention, and certainly should be more appreciative. And then it should last beyond just a day or a pandemic, into looking at how others are impacted. So that's right.
Our participants who are listening, watching this, have a lot of questions. One of them is asking about the carbon markets and how some of those practices also overlap with water quality, which is, of course, a really important issue here in Iowa. I guess Jennifer, you talked about regulations. Do we need regulations here in Iowa to encourage some of those water quality practices that can help move the needle a little bit more on conservation adoption?
I think regulations are certainly an option that would help move things forward faster. Outside that, there are things that could be done that don't necessarily regulate how you farm or what you do, in the sense of having to encourage, some of those practices that we've talked about, with cover crops or whatever it might be to help with runoff. But I think we do really need to look at some of these aspects, such as how close to the banks we farm, how, putting some sort of buffer in there, the buffer strips, unplantable area, things that can make a difference pretty quickly without necessarily forcing you to change your inputs or your practices. But again, they do make a difference to the water quality. They do make a difference to the farmer, and recognize that too. But I think we also need to look at the big picture, and things haven't been improving. I would say water quality wise is that at the rate that we would hope they would be. We still lag behind many of our neighbors when states that are working on these types of initiatives too. If we look at the testing and the numbers. But if it's not regulations, then we simply need funding to encourage a lot of this. If we talked about incentivizing only works if you've got funds to do that. And it shouldn't come, incentives and the funding for this should not come off the backs of education or any other industry either, that are going to make people resent what we're giving to the people who are feeding us, right? It shouldn't be a trade-off where we start to pit one industry and, in the area that we care about, water quality versus kids' education or whatever it might be, roads, streets. We've got to find a way that if this is a priority, which it seems to be, at least if you ask people, then it's like everything else we've talked about. There's got to be a way that everyone helps pay it. And the state appeared to support that with a fund a few years ago. And, at least the population through the vote. So now we just need to figure out how to make that happen in a way that can really provide some substantial funding to make these programs happen, whether it's the cost to implement, to build something, a filter of some sort that's permanent, whether it be something that's year to year practice that we incentivize. Again, if it's not going to be a regulation that forces you to do it, which I hesitate to do for most of these, because again, there's costs associated with it. And a regulation doesn't allow the cost to be shared by anyone else except the farmer, the producer, if we require them to do it. So if we're going to require something through regulations, then we've got to find a way to either incentivize it on a voluntary basis or a cost program to help pay for it, to do that.
Yeah, and I think certainly resources are important. Back, I guess I became Secretary of Ag back in 2007. We had no dedicated water quality funding. We had conservation funding. And Iowa was one of the few states that had conservation cost share. And over the last 15 years, 10 years, we've been able to add water quality funding without taking away any of that conservation funding, several different tranches, and now prove that we can spend $20 million a year on water quality. And we know that we can use a lot more than that. And I do think that it's important to grow it at biteable size here. I mean, I don't think you want to go from 0 to $100 million in 1 year. You need to be able to figure out how to grow. We've seen more increase in cover crop acres here than we have in any other state out there, but it was from a terribly low base, and it's still only, there's arguments out there, 3 or 4% of the land in Iowa. I've seen stuff that says 5 or 6%. I've seen stuff that said 20% of the farmers have tried them. Because they don't try them on everything. They try them on, on 80 acres and see if it works. And then they grow to 160 acres the next year. And so we are in that scaling piece, but it's slow. We only get one bite a year at planting, at the decisions that need to happen. Each year is a little different. And so it's not like it changes like inside a manufacturing plant can change. And so there's certainly an impatience by a lot of folks over trying to get that to scale the way that it could. I think there's serious conversations about more resources and significantly more resources. And I do believe as well that there's a potential if climate carbon doesn't suck up all the oxygen in the room and take us a focus away from water, there are many things that are compatible. Cover crops, buffers, there's a lot of things that are compatible between carbon sequestration and water quality. And so if we can leverage that, that may be something that brings more attention to the right kinds of practices and some more resources to getting those practices on the ground. Right? Maybe that's what water needed too, was the extra incentives that can come with carbon to be able to ramp those incentives up enough to encourage even more people to look at.
And I think in addition to the incentives, we still have to have some of those conversations about the partnerships. We talked about that with some of the other things, that this needs to, the fear of regulation, I think, makes it feel like it's the urban rural fight, or it's, the food consumers versus the food producers, right? That it's a battle, that we're trying to force you to do something through the regulation. And I think that threat still lingering there, as if this doesn't fix itself in some shape or form, that's a threat. But we've got to continue the conversations that have already started and really make it feel and be more of a partnership of, here's why we aren't getting, why we're not ramping up more. Like Bill said, is we need more funding. But I do think there's still some hesitancy on the part of a lot of producers to take some of these steps. One, the incentives probably aren't big enough, in that sense to encourage it. But I think there's a fear of, well, what if I fail? And then they're going to start to tell me I have to do, this, that, and the other, and it's going to cost me more. Or, they're just trying to tell me what to do, so I'm not going to do it until I have to. I've heard some of those conversations from time to time, and I think it's more of just a digging the heels in the ground than wanting to think about what's next. And the same incentive isn't going to be right for everyone, but the same adaptation isn't going to be right for everyone. We've talked about that with a variety of our environmental practices. Different crops, different soils need different things. So we've got to get everybody to the table if you want the flexibility. Is really what it comes down to. If you want to encourage whatever sort of regulation or incentive is going to come through to be flexible enough to meet a variety of needs, and you've got to be part of the conversation in doing so, and an active part of the conversation, listening and participating.
A participant asked your visions on what Iowa agriculture will look like in 20 years. And if your vision isn't that good, maybe you could even look at 5 to 10 years if you think it will. If we'll see a significant change in what Iowa agriculture might be.
That's a great question. And inertia is a powerful thing, right? And certainly what we know is often what we start with, and so I think we're going to grow a lot of corn and soybeans in the next 5 years, and we'll still be growing a lot in the next 20 years. But I do think there will continue to be looks at better ways to do that. I think there's going to be a lot of information that will help a producer evaluate soil health and understand what's going on in that farm. Sensors that are connected to our equipment that goes through the field, and both a landlord and a farmer is going to go, I'm building organic matter when I use cover crops. Frankly, at the end of the day, I think most of the folks the field behind me is no-till and cover crops, and most of the folks that are doing that would say, I don't care how much you give me, I'm not trading from that because it's doing good things for my land. And I really believe the most value to most of these practices will be in some resiliency during dry years, more water holding capacity. The production side, the production benefits are the ones that are hard to measure right now. But I think if we're able to capture those those may be the drivers that really bring folks to the table, more than the $15 an acre, and more than you have to, or we're going to regulate you or something like that. And so I think we're going to have more of those tools. And if we have more of those tools, then I think we've already built an understanding of some of these practices in a way that we did not have 10 years ago. Every webinar right now that I'm on, and I'm on a bunch of them, I got this little bit of time here after USDA to be on them, and everyone's about sustainability and cover crops and soil health. And that's the language within agriculture, and it's changed from where we were 5 years ago. And it takes that change to get to the place where farmers are trying something new. But if we can get the measurement to show those benefits, I think we'll see some real change.
Jennifer?
I agree with a lot of that. I think it's going to be what happens in this next 20-ish years that's really going to be the driving force here. I think if I had to pick my ideal picture, it's going to be a decision where, or a world where the producer makes the decision not necessarily by what's going to make him money, but by what's going to make him money and what's best for the soil, because this is what I get. So more of the, less monoculture, where we know how to grow soy, corn and soy, but there's a need here, I can respond to it. And so we need an industry that's more flexible, more adaptable. Part of that's going to be a big change in how USDA works with its crop supports and the programs that it does. And more emphasis on the practices that we've talked about. So we're going to have to first develop them to be able to develop programs, so it's a multi-step process. But I think we see some trends here that aren't going to go away and may only increase in the next 20 years. And the ones that concern me are we talked a little bit about land loss, but also land ownership. The study I think just came out from USDA about non-owner operations just yesterday or the day before, and the increase we're seeing there and what that means for land and agriculture and how we use that land and how those decisions are made. I think it could be a real concern in the future. But as we look at the impact of consumer demand on crops and farming as well, I think could have a significant change in how we farm and even what we farm and what we produce. As well as, we've talked most of the time about climate and carbon and those, hopefully that may have more of an impact on what we grow here and how we grow it than anything else. The prediction, if you look at where in the United States of where things grow now and how they may shift north in the next 20 to 30 years, it may be Canada growing all of this corn and soybeans, or northern Minnesota, and we're growing a lot more of the vegetables and fruit that you might see a few states south of us now. It's things like that are so unknown that really may impact what we do here and what it looks like beyond just kind of our typical economic or environmental decisions of what to grow and how to.
Thank you very much for your guys' conversation. I think we're slated to wrap up at 8 o'clock, which is coming up really soon.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Donnelle, for moderating tonight's discussion. Thank you to Secretary Northey, Professor Zwagerman. Many thanks to Professor Gathman in the Political Science Department for co-sponsoring tonight's program. We hope that this is just the latest in a long series of programs at Simpson College that examines agricultural and land use policies, environmental issues, and rural sustainability and development in Iowa and across the country. And thank you again to everyone for attending tonight's program.